Senator Ted Cruz is leading a group of 11 senators who will object unless a commission is named to investigate allegations of fraud. Senator Ted Cruz joins me right now. Senator, great to have you this morning. Happy New Year to you. Why are you doing this, and how will this play out?
Well, good morning, Maria. Happy New Year as well. Thanks for having me. Look, we're at an extraordinary time in our country's history. We went into this election with the country deeply divided, deeply polarized, and we've seen in the last 2 months unprecedented allegations of voter fraud. And that's produced a deep, deep distrust of our democratic process across the country. I think we in Congress have an obligation to do something about that. We have an obligation to protect the integrity of the democratic system. And so this past week, I spent writing out a position and assembling a group that ultimately of 11 senators that we put out yesterday that we will together object to certification in order to force the appointment of an emergency electoral commission to perform an emergency audit of the election results to assess these claims of frauds. I think we can do that. We can do it promptly. We can do it in 10 days before the inauguration. But I think we have an obligation to the voters, and we have an obligation to the Constitution to ensure that this election was lawful.
You mentioned the allegations of fraud, and in the press release announcing this commission that you'd like to see, you report on a Reuters Ipsos poll that says 39% of Americans believe the election was rigged. That belief held by Republicans, 67%, Democrats, 17%, and independents, 31%. But, Senator, we know that we heard from Bill Barr, and he said he didn't see fraud. We know that we heard from the states, and we also know that we heard from the Supreme Court, who did not hear the attacks and the cases that said there was fraud. How do you respond to that?
Well, each of those different players has a different role in our constitutional system. Bill Barr was speaking as to the evidence the Department of Justice saw. The Department of Justice wasn't administering any elections, did not have access to particularly widespread evidence on either side of the issue. As for the states, there are a lot of people in the states and state legislatures who've expressed deep, deep concerns about the unlawful practices that we saw on Election Day, that we saw particularly cities controlled by Democratic politicians shutting down the vote, throwing out observers, disregarding the law. And finally, you mentioned the Supreme Court. Listen, I wish the Supreme Court had taken this case. There were two opportunities to take this case, one out of Pennsylvania, one out of Texas. In both instances, the lawyers asked me to argue those cases. And so with regard to the Texas case, President Trump called me and said, Ted, would you do the oral argument in this case if the court takes it? I told the president, absolutely, I'd be happy to do it. I wish the court had taken one or both of those cases. I think the Supreme Court would be a better forum for resolving those issues. That obviously was the forum we resolved issues similarly in 2000 in Bush versus Gore. Unfortunately, the court declined to take those two cases, so we don't have the court stepping in to resolve it. And that's why I think Congress has a responsibility. We have an independent obligation to the Constitution. We have an independent obligation to the rule of law. And the question, look, we've got to vote on January 6th on certification. And every member of Congress faces a dilemma. Frankly, two pretty lousy choices. One, we can vote to certify, not consider any objections. If we do that, that will be heard by a lot of Americans as saying we don't think voter fraud is a real concern. We don't think these claims should be investigated thoroughly. I know that's not what most of us believe. But secondly, and I think all of us rightly don't want to be in a position where we're suggesting setting aside the results of an election just because the candidate that we supported didn't happen to prevail. That's not a principled constitutional position. That's why in assembling this group of 11 senators, I was looking for a third option, an option that was really moored in the law. And so I'll tell you what I did, Marie. I went back and looked at the historical precedents. I think the strongest precedent is the presidential election of 1876, Hayes versus Tilden. In that election, there were serious allegations of fraud in 3 different states, in Florida, in Louisiana, and in South Carolina. And what did Congress do in 1876? Now, they didn't throw up their hands and say, well, gosh, we've got allegations of fraud, but we can't do anything about it. We've just got to certify. No, they didn't do that.
Yeah.
What they did instead is they appointed a commission. It's called an electoral commission. Consisted of 5 House members, 5 senators, 5 Supreme Court justices. They considered evidence, they examined the ballots, and they made a determination based upon what the disputed ballots and what the outcome should be. What I'm arguing for is Congress ought to do the same thing. We ought to have a fair inquiry, a fair audit into these results, and we ought to resolve these claims, not just dismiss them out of hand.
What kind of pressure are you facing right now? We know that Mitch McConnell does not want any objection. We also know that Liz Cheney is telling her colleagues, why are we doing this? This is a waste of time. Don't do it. We shouldn't be putting ourselves out there. We also heard from Senator Klobuchar. She said, get a grip. Lisa Murkowski said we should not be doing this. And you know that you will require both the House and the Senate to reject the electors from a number of states in order to be successful. That's likely not happening, that you're going to win in both the House and the Senate. And what if a commission does find fraud? What happens then? Mm-hmm.
Well, listen, I think everyone needs to calm down. I think we need to tone down the rhetoric. This is already a volatile situation. It's like a tinderbox and throwing lit matches into it. And so I think the kind of hyperbole we're seeing, the kind of angry language, yesterday when I released my statement with 10 other senators, I had multiple Democrats urging that I should be arrested and tried for the crimes of sedition and treason. Now, look, that's not helpful. At a time when this country, when we're pitted against each other, just relax and let's do our jobs. We have a responsibility to follow the law. And let me say, by the way, to those members who may not have a concern about this election, whether you're a Democrat or even some Republicans, the poll numbers you covered at the top of the show, I think ought to be deeply troubling to everyone. 39% of Americans think, quote, the election was rigged. And that includes 17% of Democrats, 31% of independents. That's bad for our democracy. That's bad for the legitimacy of any subsequent presidential elections. And so dismissing these claims, I think, does real violence to our democratic system. We ought to have a serious, fair process and tribunal to consider these claims, consider them quickly, consider them expeditiously. We can do it in 10 days before the inauguration. I think that would take major steps towards reestablishing trust in our democratic process. And I believe that should be a bipartisan objective. We may be too divided today for that to happen, but Democrats should be interested in Americans having confidence in our electoral system just as much as Republicans should be.
Yeah. Senator, you are an expert on the Constitution. You are a constitutionalist. You wrote an entire book about it. What does the Constitution tell us about who decides who the president should be? What if the commission that you are explaining does form, comes back with actual evidence of fraud? Then what happens?
Well, then the results have to be set aside. If there's evidence of fraud and it's substantial and significant enough to affect the results in a particular state, then those election results would have to be set aside. And the states would then have to determine, all right, we have a valid claim here. The evidence supports it. We need to conduct elections consistent with the law. The Constitution gives the responsibility of counting the ballots to the Vice President of the United States, Vice President Mike Pence, and to both houses of Congress. And the framers of the Constitution, when they assigned a task to the Congress, they knew what they were doing. There's some folks who are saying this is purely a ministerial act. They just have to, count them and walk out and you have no judgment whatsoever. Well, that frankly doesn't make any sense. Why would the framers give to Congress something that could be given to a clerk? The reason they gave it to Congress is they understood there are difficult determinations about what counts as a valid vote. Following the 1876 election, 10 years later, in 1887, Congress passed a statute, the statute that we're operating under. It's called the Electoral Count Act. And what it provides is the mechanism for raising an objection. And it says you can raise an objection if the votes were not regularly made by lawfully certified electors. And so in this instance, If you have states that are violating the law, that are committing fraud, those votes are not being regularly made, and those are not lawfully certified electors. And so that Congress's responsibility is to address these claims. I understand that for some of my colleagues, that's a hard choice. It's not a responsibility they welcome. Whether we welcome it or not, the Constitution gives us that responsibility, and we need to step forward and defend the rule of law and protect the integrity of our elections.
Real quick as we wrap up, Senator, we are 2 days away from the Georgia Senate races. Do you believe that if the Democrats win those 2 Senate races and the Democrats take the majority in the Senate, that you will have an even larger group of senators come Wednesday, the next day, to object the results of the 2020 election? A word on Tuesday's Georgia Senate races.
Yeah, so I was in Georgia yesterday campaigning with Kelly Loeffler. I'm actually, as soon as we finish, jumping on a plane, flying back to Georgia to campaign today again. I think these 2 Georgia Senate races on January 5th are, without exaggeration, the most important Senate races of our entire lifetime. If we see a Democratic majority, a Chuck Schumer majority, I think they will do generational damage. It will empower the extreme, angry leftist voices in the Democratic Party. And so I would say to folks at home, if you are in Georgia, please, please, please come out and bring your friends and your family and your neighbors, because we're seeing massive Democratic turnout and the consequences. Yeah. I think the people of Georgia want to see a reasonable check and balance. They don't want to see the extreme, the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warrens and AOCs having no restraints on them whatsoever. Georgia will decide that, and I'll tell you what, I think we're going to win both races in Georgia, but it's going to depend on turnout on Election Day.
All right, Senator, we'll be watching, and of course, the very next day, the joint session of Congress. As important, we will be there. Thank you so much, Senator. We will watch the developments. Thanks for being here. Senator Ted Cruz.